like the video, subscribe for more horror, and drop your country in the comments. Now get ready. This story comes from a place most people fear to remember. I'll tell you this the way I remember it because memory is all that stands between what the Hollow did and the world that still pretends it can't happen. My name is Samir and I worked as a field surveyor for old settlements, a job that long ago taught me how to reason away the things that make other people run. A cracked lintel becomes a storm's work, a bent nail becomes the slow slide of age. But there are places where your tools cannot reach, where ledger and logic are thin as tissue, against what waits in the soil, and Salim Hollow was one of them. A bowl of earth folded into hills 2 days' ride from the nearest town, and a place people crossed quickly by default until the road gave out, and then they crossed it quickly by fear because children in surrounding villages were taught to point and say the Hollow keeps its own kind of watch. I wasn't supposed to go deeper than the edge, but my bike broke on the mud track after an unexpected rain and I walked the last mile. The lane. Crunching under my boots, reeds whispering under a pale sky like secret hisses, and even in the daylight the place felt wrong. Houses were small and low, clustered like bundled clothes, roofs thatched, walls of sun-baked clay stained with age. But what struck me first was a hush, not ordinary village quiet but a weight that sat on the throat, as if sound itself had been taught manners there. The central well was older than the oldest man I met, a rim of black stone worn flat by generations, and people had nailed boards and iron across it so decades of children wouldn't peer down where the darkness refused return. But the boards were not full of nails now, and the iron lay pushed aside as if something had rolled the lid away from the inside. The woman I spoke to first. She was the hearth-keeper, thin-voiced and with palms creased by too many small fires. She warned me with eyes that did not look directly at mine. "Do not answer," she said, and her lips trembled because saying anything aloud seemed to feed a hunger the Hollow loved. At night I set up a small camp in the empty teacher's hut because the inn had closed its only room and the teacher had left his cot in the corner as if expecting guests he never hoped to see. And what I refused to accept at first was a soft, slow movement under the ground that you feel in your jaw and the soles of your feet like a subtle rhythm, like breath, and I blamed it on the wind until the wind stopped and the breath kept on, and the candle. Smoke rose then fell as if inhaled, and every sound around me became a fragile instrument against a giant, sleeping thing. That evening the old man with the lantern, the one who had passed me a thermos at the road, came and sat at the doorway while I drank thin tea, and he told me in a voice already brittle with years that their fathers remembered a bargain and bargains have weights. When he spoke, the floorboards under our feet made a faint answering murmur, and outside the well the reeds bent without wind, then straightened as if something had stood and walked away. He did not say the Hollow wanted food, or land, or even blood precisely. He said it was patient and it kept what sounded like hunger. Names, voices, the small signatures of people in the world who made sound and meaning and warmth, and the Hollow ate the echo and kept the likeness like a collector keeping portraits, and when a voice pleased it, it learned that voice and could call in its notes later, and the one who answered back found the Hollow's teeth in them. I told him such things were old stories, and he laughed, but his laugh had no warmth, and when he left I sat awake listening, and when midnight came the cottage seemed to inhale with a long, slow pull, and a whisper rose from the stone under my mattress. First a sibilant nothing, then a syllable like a pebble in a cup, and then my name, slurred as if it had been tasting its own letters for the first time, and my own voice, echoed back wrong, made the hairs along my arms rise not because of superstition but because of recognition, a recognition used to trap things. I slept in the cot with the covers pulled up and the old man's thermos at my feet, and when I dreamed the well was open and I felt a child run into the Hollow and never heard him again, and when dawn bled into the sky the woman who had warned me returned to the hut and left a strip of cloth on my sleeping mat, knotted small and damp as if it had been used to mop tears, and said, "Tie this now and do not answer." And I tied it because a superstition may be all your hands have to hold onto when reason fails you. By the second day, the Hollow shifted from being the village's story into the actual measure of my life there, because it began to answer in ways I could not tidy into explanation. I woke with a memory of my brother's laugh on my lips, though he'd been gone from my life for 10 years and no one had spoken his name in Salim Hollow. I found a scrap of paper in the dirt by the well with my name across the top in a hand I did not recognize, and when I pocketed it a child in the lane watched me with eyes too still and said in a thin voice, "It likes the ones who carry names," And that evening the bell in the mosque chimed, though the imam was at prayer a mile away and the rope hung slack in his hands. People moved in their yards like dolls that had been wound up and walked through ancient grooves they remembered like a ritual, because the hollow taught them small things to keep the roof intact, small gifts for its patience. They lit candles in wrong hours. They left bowls of water that steamed black in the moonlight, and they smeared clay along thresholds as if they tried to draw the hollow into a single small place. The sound the hollow made was not always words. Sometimes it breathed like wind through reeds, and sometimes it imitated the clumsy rhythms of a kettle boiling in another house, and each imitation carried a grain of the life it had tasted, as if toys were made from stolen voices. One night, reckless because fear warped decision, I climbed the ridge behind the graves to watch the well from above, and the sight of the village under the hollow's small, moving cloud broke something inside me. Shadow limbs slipped from the mist like low branches and bent toward the earth, and the people moving under them answered with little sounds as if repeating lines of a play, no more or less, the sort of recitation that would have been charming if the players were alive. A woman on her porch repeated a lullaby I had known as a child, but wrong. A neighbor's laugh came, thin and mechanical, and the old man who had laughed with no warmth walked alone with his tongue working at the roof of his mouth as if learning lines. That night I listened under the ridge, and the hollow called not just my name but the name of the city where I had grown up and a teacher I loved, and I flinched because the hollow's vocabulary included what I had thought private, and when a voice calls what you only hold inside you, it feels like a hand on the back of your throat. I tried to leave then on the cracked road, but my motorcycle refused the engine's cough. Fuel was full, the spark was true, and yet the starter turned thickly as if the air itself had weight. Frustrated, I went back to the teacher's hut and found my notebook gone, though I had left it under the cot, and in its place a scrap with a name I had never heard, and the child in the lane watched with a small smile and said, "Names make a trail," and then another voice, not the child's, dragged my own name through the air and answered my small hello with my brother's laugh, and the world folded and anchored itself in that imitation, and my chest tightened until I could not breathe. You think you will madly run, or shout, or fix what is broken. But a hush in a place like Salim makes movement a betrayal, because any loudness might be an offering, and so people learn to speak with their eyes and their hands and to keep their throats closed. The villagers taught me the customs in whispers. If the hollow called, do not answer it directly, do not repeat the words it uses, never tell it a name you protect, and when you heard a voice you loved, speak low and empty. Add a soundless step back and a prayer you do not say aloud, because prayers said aloud were purchases for the hollow's learning. But rules make fragile fences, and at midnight the hollow tried instruments I could not have imagined, sending up small flickers of memory and asking me to feed them back like a child begging for a repeat, and it gave me my own voice sounding older, looser, then asked me to say the name of my mother, and the temptation to test whether a thing was only mimicry is an old human luxury. You lean into the warmth and the thing takes the whole night. I did not speak my mother's name, though coldness wrapped my ribs that night, and after the bell tolled I found outside my hut a shell of a watch I last saw as a child, and under it a note, written in a hand that learned the cadence of my writing. "A lesson," it said. "The hollow learns by tethering." I realized then it wasn't merely hungry. The hollow refused to be unknown. It wanted history, intimacy, the map of places inside you. And if you gave it a corner of yourself, it would keep the shape like a collection and call it up at will. By the third night, the hollow had graduated from mimicry into creation. Its sounds grew confident and layered, and the land shifted to help it show off. Fields that had been flat curled slightly as if waves were forming under them, and the reeds grew toward the shapes that moved in the fog like hands toward a body that would dress them. The villagers had become part of its stage, their faces expressionless, as if someone had smeared wax across the features because they had been chosen by the hollow to hold props. A man bawled and his words came out like bits of rope. A woman beat a pan and the clanging sounded like a bell, but the tone was from her grandmother's wedding decades ago, and the hollow was learning lineage, not just sound. There were few of us who watched and few who could leave, and I counted us. The hearth woman who refused to speak to me more than necessary. The old man with the lantern who tried to act like the time had not come, the child priest who walked barefoot, and whose toes were black with years of repetitive kneeling, and myself, who had come to measure and instead became measured. One dusk, driven by an ache that was part anger and part investigator's hunger, I crept to the well and peered downward with a flashlight, and the beam was swallowed. replaced by a panorama of whispers and shapes, a corridor of sound that stretched downward like a throat, and at its bottom something moved, the size of a hill or the patience of one, and from it rose the imitation of limbs that pulled up likenesses from the mud. A faint face surfaced for an instant, familiar, wrong, like an old photograph altered with a crude hand, and it called my name with a syllable smoothed as if by water, and at that instant the child priest touched my sleeve and pointed without expression at an old phrase carved on stone at the rim of the well I had not noticed earlier, a line written in a script almost forgotten, and its translation, the teacher had told me later when he could find words, meant roughly, feed the hollow with the empty, as if one could give it the husk of sound without giving it the center. The villagers had tried for generations to cheat the payment by offering husks, empty words, scribbles, meaningless sounds meant to distract the hollow from what truly nourished it, but the hollow learned from emptiness as well and adapted its hunger. That night the child priest brought a bowl of dried petals and sang a lullaby not sung in 100 years. And the hollow took the tune and dressed it in new voices that wandered into the lane like stray ghosts, and the doors of houses opened then closed with little jerks as if hands had closed them and not the people inside, and the old man with the lantern watched with his mouth dry and said, "We'll need to pay differently," and the woman who once warned to never answer kissed her palm and touched my forehead with it like an elder marking a wound, and later when I tried to sleep the world hummed. And then I heard a voice from outside that sounded like my brother asking me to come outside because he had found something wonderful, and the ache to go to him was the same ache that turns children toward dangerous pools, and I had to fight it and sleep behind a closed door to keep the voice from stealing my step. You do not know how subtle temptation can be until something mimics your longings exactly and then asks you to deliver them to it for safekeeping. The hollow began to arrange these requests into shapes. It asked the child to hum a certain note and then used that note to pull a figure from the field. It asked the old man to call out a village prayer and then taught a shape to answer that prayer from under the earth, and those shapes grew patient and used and began to walk a slow circuit around the houses and test the thresholds for weakness. By the end of that night I no longer understood where the hollow ended and the village began, and I realized that our silence and our offerings had not been a protection but a training period. The hollow had been learning how to hold the world so that it would not feel like a theft when it took. The final night came with rain in the distance and with a taste of iron in my mouth, and I remember every small choice I made because the count of choices is all that remains when you try to account for a life after a thing has unstitched it. The villagers had burned what little they had to feed the hollow. Bowls of stale rice boiled into a dark paste, children's toys left at the well like talismans, names carved into the palm of wood to be sunk in water. And still it wanted more, and the hollow's requests changed from trivialities into edges. "A name that has not been shared," the child priest whispered one night, a sound kept in memory, and I knew the meaning as a rumor at last. It wanted the private things, the things we do not spill because their edges hurt, the lullabies behind a mother's breath, the promises made at graves, the nicknames you never let the world hear. I had tried for days to hold something back, to keep my father's voice and my shame and the timetable of my small betrayals private, but the hollow was like a thief who studies a house for months and then returns at last when the household trusts the locks. In the rain leaned dark the child priest came to my door and said simply, "They ask for a promise." And I understood he did not know what he was saying any more than his hands knew the weather, because the hollow had rearranged the world so that his small fingers could no longer tell right from necessary. But he had been chosen as a messenger. And that was enough for those bound in debt. The old man's lantern burned thinner and his eyes had hollows like the figures now wandering the fields, and the woman who had tied cloth on my wrist took my hand that evening and placed in it a scrap of paper. "Swear," she said, "and you will be free this season." And the paper had lines to sign and a place to write the name of someone you would keep silent to protect. A ritual contract disguised as mercy, and I could have refused and run to the hills, but by then my bike plasticized in the rain and the flood of fog blocked all paths, and I was fragile with the knowledge that speaking a secret in the wrong place draws a map for monsters. My words felt small, but I signed not out of cowardice only, and not only out of fear, but because the child on the path, the one with 2 clear teeth, had his head bent and whispered in my ear, "Save the sick child." And I thought of the woman's fevered son under the blankets and the bargain made long ago and the small kindnesses masked as sacrifice, And so I wrote my name and the name I would guard, and I sealed the paper with a ring of clay. And for a night the world that kept the hollow was mute, and the thin pressure underfoot eased like a hand finally letting go. In that lull I slept and dreamed of air without the taste of names, where my voice lived in me instead of as a token in a bowl. Morning came with a hard sky and a thin wind, and the villagers moved as if relieved, faces slack like people who have carried a weight and found a place to drop it, and I walked toward the road at last, my bag heavy with what little I had, and as I crossed the lane by the well, the old man followed a few steps behind me and touched the rim with his lantern like a priest blessing a wound, and he said, "Remember, do not repeat what you heard. Some debts are paid into sleep." I walked that road until the hollow's roofs were a thin ribbon on the horizon and believed I had left it behind. But the hollow's learning leaves threads behind like roots, and sometimes when a phone rings in the night and a voice on the other end answers with the wrong timbre, or when a random memory slides loose and lands in your lap with a weight you did not expect, you feel the small absence a hollow took, a missing tone like a tooth pulled too near the root. I kept my promise for a year and then another, and the hollow's appetite softened for a while as if it needed to wait for new things to learn. But the knowledge of what lives under earth that breathes patiently is a ledger I carry like a bruise. And now I tell you, because silence is also a tool the hollow can own. If you walk a lane and feel beneath your soles a slow rhythm, if reeds bend without wind, if the well's lid has shifted even a little, do not stop. Do not answer. Do not give it a name. Walk away and promise yourself you will not repeat what it taught you to love, because a hungry thing that learns your voice learns how to call your children home.